way to work myself out beyond just the two possibilities of figure grounding the change into this three or multiples of three-part organization. And this allowed me to do paintings like this. This was kind of a de Kooning-esque painting study, but I mean, you can see the same color idea at work. That's maybe a bad slide, but there's basically three colors there: yellow with a lot of dark in it to make it look like the same darkness as the blue, so that you could organize it in terms of saturation, in terms of hue, or in terms of light, dark. And then at the same time, I was working on these watercolors and pushing the ambiguity that was possible spatially through the natural transparency that came out of the watercolors, so that I could lay over, and this is now familiar to you because you've seen what I've been doing recently with them. But these were ones that I did in the 60s, and they were working wet over dry and in a very kind of arbitrary, impulsive way, but just selecting one color and laying it down, and then waiting for it to dry, and laying another color down and waiting for it to dry, and then creating a kind of multiple spatial ambiguity through this manner. And all of this really led me to understanding various possibilities in painting, and I moved on to paintings like this that I was doing at the same time as I was doing the painted wooden columns. And you can see that I'm using orthogonal perspective here to make a kind of ambiguous flip-flop, so that it flip-flops every possible way that you can possibly organize it. And then I'm playing around with the color organization and the color sequence to make continuous transparencies, which, if anything, tend to flatten it out or play around also with those spatial shifts and spatial changes. And I'm just showing you like one or two examples in each case of what are lots of examples. But so these were from 1968. And then I moved on after a period of kind of struggling through with ideas in the sculpture and being interested in the fact that it had many realities because of the fact that you walked around it, you saw it from close up, you saw it from far away. And I wanted to somehow figure out a way of doing a painting that had those same qualities. I wanted to do a painting that had multiple structures to it, that wasn't just a single structure that you saw from an ideal viewing distance, like the notion of perspective, but a painting that worked close up and middle distance and far away, that worked when you scanned it, that worked when you fixated on it, that, in other words, that you could structure in any way that you possibly felt was valid for the way you played around with your vision. And I hit on this idea of little bits of color. The entire 6-foot square painting is made up of little half-inch squares of color. There are only 4 colors involved. Again, this is going back to an idea of visual primaries of blue and yellow and red and green, obviously carefully selected and spaced apart, and then the various different kinds of organizations that the eye makes from close up or from far away when you see the different groupings of this painting. And I was also very interested in how it shifted, how your vision shifted as you fixated on it and as you played around with it from various distances. And there were a whole selection of paintings that were done this way, but it was really an effort to push Gibson's idea of perception being a very active enterprise to the notion of painting. And I wanted to expand the field of the viewer as much as possible. Because was still, no matter how big a painting you did, it was still kind of a postage stamp on the wall if you got far enough away. But so I thought, well, I could, I wanted to expand this, and I did these 30-foot paintings in the 70s that took the same idea that you saw, or the same kind of organization that you saw in that first grid painting like that, and expanded it to 30 feet. And this also breaks down into 1-inch squares of yellow, red, blue, green, but in very low saturations, and in 5 different levels of light-dark value. So it's the same 4 hues in the dark, in the dark neutral, in the neutral, in the light neutral, and the lighter one. And then you, of course, you experience it differently as you're close up, as you far away, as you look at it and scan it, as you fixate on it, all the different ways that you might see it. This was another example of a 30-foot painting done that way. This one based more directly on the spectrum, and also with constant size squares. And then I decided I wanted to investigate the notion of the size of the squares a little bit more directly. I went on to a series of paintings which actually use squares, grids of squares of different sizes, so that each of the grids of color, I don't know how well you see it in the slide, perhaps you do, are made up of little grids of color, and they are different size grids depending upon how much contrast there is between the hue and the fixed ground. So the fixed ground on the left is white, the fixed ground on the right is black, and so the smallest squares are the yellow, the saturated yellow on the black, and the largest squares are the unsaturated tint of yellow on the white. And then they progressively change in each one of them. And actually the areas in between each of those vary depending upon how much contrast there is between the large 2x2 areas of those colors. And of course this maintains the idea of transparency and apparent transparency and a kind of spatial ambiguity as you look at it. And I then used that idea to make a series of paintings which went back to the patterns of that earlier painting, but with different size grids involved, so that there are different sizes of grids depending upon the amount of contrast between the color or the number of colors, because I discovered that clearly when you were trying to fuse 4 colors, that maintained a different level of contrast than if you were trying to fuse just 2 colors. And so where there are 4 colors, they tend to be smaller grids. Where there are 3 colors, a little bit larger than the 4. And when there are only 2 colors, larger still. And then all of that changing depending upon the amount of contrast between one color and the next. These were tremendously time-consuming paintings to do because they were lots of colors. This is 25 colors involved, and one had to coordinate the 25 colors and figure it out and do tests of each of the areas in order to figure out what size grid there should be. And so there were lots of tests and visual tests to do each of the paintings. And this is now in the early 80s, but about this time I took a sabbatical, and I went to Europe, and I traveled to The Hague, where I saw the Maritz House. I was interested in seeing the Maritz House, where you know there are 6 Vermeers, including the view of Delft, and also the Gomeda Museum, where there are 250 Mondrians. And as I was about to drive out of town in a rented car with my wife and a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, we saw in the town brochure that there was something called the Panorama Mestag. And I said, well, we're going to drive right by it. Let's go see what that is. I didn't have any idea what it was. And I parked the car outside the Panorama Mestag and said to my wife, I'll just run in and see if this is worth seeing, and then I'll come back out. And 40 minutes later, I came back to total chaos, of course. And it was just an unbelievable and fantastic experience to experience a panorama for the first time. It turns out this is really one of the great extent panorama paintings in the world. It's been restored and renovated since then, and so it's in great shape. This is a fisheye view taken from a position that you don't normally get to see if you visit there. you see that you would come up a circular staircase